I am talking to Michael Ruskin. Michael Ruskin is the author of the book A Vow, a Love Story. So, Michael, just what made you write the book? I know it's about your parents. If you can give us some idea on why did you write the book and why did you write it now?
Well, the reason I wrote the book was because I was very disturbed about the situation that was going on in the country even years ago. When my brother passed away in 2008, I became the last surviving member of my family. And I felt, since my parents were both Holocaust survivors from the country of Lithuania, they rarely spoke about their experiences back then. And what happened in 1993, Derek, is I found documents on my father's night table after he passed away from an illness in Miami Beach, Florida. In those documents were testimonies from the doctors and lawyers who were petitioning the German courts for reparations. And here it is, September 27th, 1993. I'm in my parents' condo. My father passed away. And I'm sitting at 11 o'clock at night looking at these documents, stories I never knew about. And this is where the testimony my parents were giving back in '64. And that was the beginning of my mission to make sure that someday I was going to write a book and tell people things that most people didn't know about, because I had a personal accounting of what my parents went through as their son. So that was the main impetus of the book. And by the way, so your audience knows, the documents I found at that night table is now in the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Okay.
And it's also in my book. So if they go to the back of my book, they'll also see the documents that I found back in '93.
Okay. That's good to know. And tell us a bit about your parents, Michael.
Okay, so my mother was one of 9 children. My grandfather, her dad, was a rabbi in Mažeikiai, Lithuania, and they came from a very conservative family. It was a very small shtetl, a very small town in northern Lithuania. There, she got educated in one of the private schools. They lived on a farm, and they were raised in a very conservative Jewish rabbi home. In 1937, she ended up getting accepted to a teacher's college in Kaunas, which was the capital city at that point of Lithuania. And so she went there, and then also she had 2 brothers who were going to the yeshiva there. So again, as I said, she was one of 9 children. And she was raised in an atmosphere that was very loving family, but they had their rules.
Yeah.
So it was a very well loved family, and they respected their father and my grandmother, and they lived a rather good life. The rabbi was very well respected in the town. He would teach scriptures during the week to the local people. He would bring people in their homes during the high holy days. He was very well loved. But my mother ended up going to Kaunas, and then I'm just going to go into how she met my father.
Yeah.
My father came from a town called Kădaň, which is closer to Kaunas, and he was going to a vocational school. He came from a whole different background. My grandfather owned a haberdashery. He sold scarves, different types of hats and gloves. Very poor family. He went to vocational school and then ended up going to Kaunas to become an electrician. So he ended up going to Kaunas, getting a construction job. And there is where my dad and my mother met, in the apartment building. He moved in 2 floors up from where my mother was living with my aunt. My mom and my sister, my aunt, were living on one of the floors, and that's where they met. And so in 1938, they started to court. They fell in love, and then they got married in '39, and they ended up having their first child in 1940.
Okay, so they were already married before the war started in Europe.
That's right.
Okay, and they went through quite some horrific times during those years, 1940, 45. So talk us through that, Michael. So I know that, as I'm aware, they've been through not one, they had been to several concentration camps. Am I right in believing that?
Well, my parents were actually put in two separate concentration camps. My father was in Dachau. My mother was in Stutthof, which is in northern Poland. Just to back up, Derek, my book, although has chapters about the concentration camps, I focused a lot on the ghettos because a lot of people out there don't know how many Jews died in the ghettos during the late 30s into the mid 40s. My sister, who was 3.5 years old, was actually murdered in the ghetto in their apartment when it was called, they raided the apartment buildings all through the time. My parents were in the ghetto for 4 years. And at the last raid of the apartments, they were taking the children, and they were exterminating children because they were liquidating the Kovna ghetto and moving the final residents into the concentration camps. And they believed that the women would be less encumbered when they went to work for the German war machine, making different types of equipment or different types of material for the Germans. So, and they also wanted to destroy the next generation of Jews. So up to that point, Derek, when they had these raids, they would go in and take jewelry, appliances, clothes, take anything from the apartment buildings in the Kovna ghetto. And this happened in other ghettos too. And of course, if you objected, they would hit you over the head or take you to the extermination building and kill you. So they had free reign of the apartment buildings. This is after they were put into the ghetto living in Kaunas. And this goes back to where they took the Jews out of the major city and then put them into the ghetto and barbed wired the ghetto around and kept them in a confined area, which they said was going to be a safe zone. I'm kind of backing up. When the Germans ended up arriving in Lithuania, Russia annexed Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia a year before. And when the Russians were there, they ended up deporting many of the Lithuanian locals. And the Lithuanian locals were blaming the Jews for collaborating with the Russians. And so when the Russians were basically taking over the factories and the stores and the businesses from the Lithuanians, a lot of them, as I said, were sent to the Siberia to work in the Gulag there. And so when the Germans arrived in 41, the locals thought that they were going to get sovereignty because the Germans were here. And the Germans, when they arrived in 41, they were asking the Jews, the Lithuanians in that town, tell us the homes where the Lithuanians live, and then go out and get your guns and your bats and your knives and do what you want to have to do, because there was a lot of animosity because they, as I said before, they believed that the Lithuanians, that the Jews were collaborating with the Russians and it was payback. And that is why the ghetto was established, to bring the Jews into the ghetto for their safety, when all it was a place of systematic murder.
So
go ahead.
So basically the Jews, they were persecuted by the Russians, by the Germans, and by the Lithuanians. The three groups were going after them.
Right, exactly.
And I'm sorry to hear about your sister, about 3.5 years old. That gives me the chills. And every time I hear something like that, that's just incomprehensible for me. How can that be?
Just to let you know, Derek, the hardest chapter for me to write was the chapter Death of Innocence, where I talk about the children.
Yeah.
And it was, even to this day, there's a picture of a little girl named Lena who was born in the Kovna ghetto with my sister. And I didn't know this until I went to the Yad Vashem website in Jerusalem. that she was born and she died almost on the exact same time as my sister. And there, that time at the in the Kindernacht, there was the children's action. They took 1,600 children under the age of 12 and then threw them on a truck and then deported them. They drove them into the extermination building a couple miles away, and they shot most of the children there. Anyway, to get what happened was, and not to go into a lot of detail because it's in my book, my father dug a hole underneath the floorboard of their apartment. They were sharing the apartment with 2 other families, and underneath the floorboard, he built what they call a spider hole. And in that hole, he put various rations and water and enough food to stay alive for a couple days inside underneath the floor. So what happened was my father was on a work detail. What they were doing, they were waking up the men at 4 o'clock in the morning and marching them off to the factories to work for the Germans. And they left the buildings basically empty except for the women and the children and some of the elderly. And so on March 27th, 1944, the Germans and 28, the Germans raided the apartment buildings to take the children. They were running up the different floors, just grabbing the apartments, just grabbing the children and throwing them on trucks. And in my book, I talk about how the families were running after it was just horrible. So what happened was, to make a long story short, my mother and my sister were hiding underneath the floorboard. And by the way, this information I'm telling you is in the documents.
Yeah.
I didn't know all this. And so they were hiding underneath the floor. And then apparently what happened, and I'm just surmising now, my sister was only 3.5. Somehow the Germans heard them under the floor and picked up the rug and the table, and they opened up the hole, and there at the bottom of the hole was my mother and my sister. And there the Germans ended up struggling with my mother because they were trying to grab Rose out of my mother's hands. And she was fighting all along. Towards the end of the skirmish, they walked out of the apartment building, and one of the SS officers turned around with the butt of his rifle and hit my mother in the head and knocked her out cold. And then my father came back from work. He walked into the apartment, seeing how it was totally ransacked and because they were looking for people in the apartments. And that's where my sister was taken. They never saw her again. And what was even harder than that, Derek, 3 months later, in July of 1944, they were then put on separate boxcars and taken to separate concentration camps. And that's where the vow comes in, was the vow, A Love Story in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It was on a trade platform 3 months after Rose passed away that they made a vow that if either one were to live, they were to go back to where they first met 5 years before to find out if the other one was still alive. They did not know where they were going at the time they were put onto the boxcars. All they were told was they were being displaced for their safety. They did not know my father and the boys were going to Dachau, the women and the children were going to Stutthof. And they didn't see each other for almost 9 months. So you can imagine, I mean, anybody who had experienced this, I mean, I don't know how many people would have survived that experience over just a few months, losing their daughter and then being shipped away and being away from your spouse.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't imagine that myself. How I would survive or how I would react. I just have no idea on how I would survive. But it's what I get out of this now as well. The cynicism of the Nazis as well. They told the parents they were being transported for their safety. And that was the message were often told to Jews, not only Jews but also the Roma, anyone who was deported to concentration camps. They would say, "We're deporting you for your safety," and that's what's so cynical, giving that bit of false hope as well on top of what they knew, what was really going to happen to them anyhow. So. But
one other area I wanted to touch on real quickly is that they also have what they call selection process where they would line up the Jews in the town square, and they would examine them to see if they were fit for work, and if they were strong enough to work. And if you went to the right, you would live. If you went to the left, if you were too old or too sick, within a few days, you were shipped to the extermination building a few miles away and exterminated.
Yeah,
and that was also very terrifying.
Yeah, and I know I visited Dachau there a couple of weeks ago, and it was a bizarre kind of feeling, strange to describe it. It's I have no words for it. I'm happy that I went there, but I can only slightly imagine how I must have felt being deported there, because even we were there on a very hot day, and we were told what they had to do. Even standing there for hours and hours in the heat or in the extreme cold. I can only imagine that, but I understand Stutthof is actually even worse place than Dachau. But your parents survived, and
Yes.
How what were they liberated the same day as anyone else in Dachau or Stutthof, or how were they liberated? How did they get out?
My mother was liberated while she was on the death march. I'm sure you're aware that what they did as the Allies were closing in, they were taking the Jews to different camps to keep away from the Allies, but keep the Jews working and keep the Jews dying.
Yeah.
And so my mother was liberated by the Russians as she was being marched to the Baltic Sea, where they were putting them on barges and shipping them to Germany to work. And when they got into the Baltic, they opened up with their machine guns, the Germans, and they were shooting the Jews in the water in the Baltic Sea as they were trying to swim to the barge. And this is after 6 or 7 days of marching from Kazan, Poland, up to the Baltic. My mother was liberated right before she got to the beach with my aunt. And so the Germans came from out of the woods, and they shot the German guards as they were marching. And that's how my mom was liberated. My father was liberated in Dachau. He also was on a death march, but he was liberated by the Americans, and there was not that much shooting involved. He was being marched to southern Germany to work at a concentration camp there. And then my father ended up going into a hospital, and then he had, we would call a mission, and that's one of the chapters. My father ended up spending almost 9 weeks looking for my mother in the various displacement camps as he was walking from Munich, Germany, not walking, but he was also going by bus and by train and being picked up by GIs. He was traveling back to Lithuania from Munich, Germany, and he was looking for my mother for nearly 9 weeks, not knowing if she was dead or alive. And as he was going into displacement camps, and that happened after the war, the refugees got into displacement camps wanting to immigrate to different countries, Israel, United States, England. And so he ended up finding a man outside of Białystok, Poland, and they reunited. And I don't want to go into it because the way they found each other is a miraculous journey. My father met a man on the street who was in the apartment building the time that my sister was taken. He was in the next door building, and they were friends. And my father went into this town, and he actually met him on the street and saw my mother only a few hours earlier. And that's how my father found my mother.
That's such an amazing, but that's what makes the whole narrative of the Holocaust often so, I don't know how to describe it, but unbelievable. Because there were so many awful horrors, but there was also these little trinkets of miracles, like your parents finding each other again. I mean, because the likelihood that they would have survived was very small, was nearly zero really for most of them, but they did. And from there, then they reunited, and they decided then to move, and they eventually moved to America. I understand. So why did they pick the USA to go there?
a good question. What happened was they were in the camp. And by the way, to give you a quick update, my mother opened up the first school in the fair involved displacement camp, where she taught the orphan children.
Okay.
About 4,000, and there she met General Eisenhower, which is in my book. There's a picture of General Eisenhower in my book with my 6-month-old brother at the time in his baby carriage, and the picture of General Eisenhower standing there with my brother in the baby carriage, crying with a bunch of dignitaries who were honoring my mother that day in 46, I'm sorry. Anyway, so what happened was my father got a letter from my cousin from Johannesburg, South Africa, and they were going to sponsor my parents. And at the same time, they got a letter from my great uncle in Brooklyn, New York, who wanted to sponsor my parents. This was my mother's grandmother's father's brother, and they decided they would come to the United States. My brother was already born. He was born in 46. And then I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 49. And so they spent almost, it was almost, let me see, it could have been close to 4 years. Not 4 years, I'm sorry. They were close to a year or two into the displacement camp before they ended up
finally moving to the US.
Well, they didn't fly, they took a boat.
It takes a bit longer.
They took a ship into Ellis Island. And, in the book, I talk about how they see the skyline and the lights, and they're all excited because the first time they're landing in Ellis Island. And it was very exciting to know that now they're becoming American citizens.
Yeah, I mean that's wonderful. But they never spoke about their ordeal to you. So how because you're like the second generation, really. That's how was it growing up as a son of survivors? Because they must have had lots of traumas.
No, it wasn't easy, Derek. First of all, I only spoke Yiddish until I got into the second grade. So when I would go to school in second grade, I'd speak to them in Yiddish. They didn't know what I was talking about. Here I'm living in Brooklyn, and I was talking to these children in Yiddish. They didn't know. My mother was they were very shut down emotionally. You can understand that. They lost their daughter, they lost their families. My parents were not very warm in the sense of affection, showing love. They were always criticized. And that's how they showed their love, by being very protective. When I was very young, my mother would walk me to school hand in hand in my kindergarten, first grade. And my schoolmates were going with their other schoolmates. And here my mother was standing outside the schoolyard waiting for me to come out so she could walk me home, because she was so afraid that someone was going to take me because I was her youngest. So it was very smothering growing up. She always wanted to know where I was going, what I was doing. They had a tendency of, as I said, they rarely spoke about it. Maybe once in a while they would watch World at War documentary on television, and my father would make mention of what he was watching, that he was there in those documents. I could not connect my parents to them. They didn't talk about it, so I couldn't really relate that well, because I didn't know that much. Yeah. But anyway, they had a tendency of eating very fast. As I said, they were very protective, and they had a tendency of, and this is kind of humorous, every Thursday they'd go shopping, grocery shopping. They'd come back with toilet paper. Every week they would end up putting more and more toilet paper into the closet. It would be from the floor up to the ceiling of toilet paper. Like I could wonder, why do you keep getting toilet paper? And of course, it's because in the camps they didn't have any toilet paper. So it was kind of odd, but I do understand.
So, looking back, all of that makes sense, of course. Yeah. But then you found all these documents, and there must have been a bit of a shock as well for you reading that. And,
without a doubt. It was when I found those documents, I could not believe what I was reading. I went over there to clean up the condo. My brother and I were selling the condo, and the real estate people were coming over the next day. So I wanted to go in there and straighten up the place. My father had just passed away. And as I said, I went into his night table, and I found this manila folder. I opened the folder, and in German and English are all this information. And I realized on the heading of the paper, it was a few doctors and a few lawyers, and they were writing testimony about what happened to my parents, both emotionally and physically. And that was then sent as petitions to the German government in '64. And they got reparations that way. And it talks about my sister and my father was responsible for taking the bodies off the electrical fences in Dachau for those Jews who were trying to escape or wanted to commit suicide.
Yeah, I mean, that's if someone who hasn't lived, you just can't imagine that, and that's just the horrors of that. So that stays with you. That there's no way of we talk about PTSD, but that's PTSD by 10, I reckon. So
I can't imagine how anybody could have raised my brother and I as well as they did. It's also amazing that here, almost 15 years later, in 1964, they had to recount all the experiences, what happened to them 15 years earlier, to the doctors and the attorneys. They had to relive all that past that happened 15 to get that on paper so they could send it to Germany.
Yeah.
You could imagine, I don't know how they did it, Derek. I mean, they were just incredibly strong people.
Yeah, but that's what I get from most of the survivors. They're always very strong characters, and the protectiveness of their children. I hear that a lot. That your story resonates with so many other stories, and I can totally understand that, because I mean, they've been through such horrendous times, and like your mother saw her own daughter being murdered and in front of her. That's not something you I mean, I don't even know if I could survive that, leave alone live through it. So,
well, I mean, she wasn't really murdered in front of them, but she was taken away to
murder.
Yeah. But I want to tell you that when I leave my audience is that and it's a spiritual book, Derek. It's inspirational because it wasn't for the strength of their human spirit, the love they had for each other, the faith in God, and their courage, they would never have survived.
Yeah.
And so what I say to people is, if my parents got down to where they connected to their soul and their spirit to actually live, that whatever hardship or whatever circumstance you face, if my parents were able to get through that, you certainly can get through any circumstance that you're being faced with as well.
Exactly. And on that note, Michael, because we're running a bit out of time, we're going to leave it with that. Just before I leave, just give us the name again of your book and where we can find it.
Okay, the book again is called The Vow, a lovestory.com. You can get it only through my website. It is not on the booksellers, not on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I have it as an ebook and I have it as a book. And you just go to the website or you can Google my name or Google Michael Ruskin. It's number 6 on Google as the most widely distributed book in the world right now. You could get it in Europe, you can get it here in the States. But you can go, and as I said, it's the vow, a lovestory.com, and goes right to the website. Okay. And by the way, we're working on a possible movie that's not really announced yet, but we're getting close to possibly writing a screenplay.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. That would make a great movie, and I will look forward to that. Michael, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we'll talk again, maybe if there's a potential movie coming out. So you never know, but thanks for talking to us.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.